David straightened his black tie for the third time and checked his reflection in the restaurant's polished glass door. His hands were steady, but his heart was beating a little faster than usual. Tonight wasn't just another shift at Le Bernardin. Tonight, he was serving one of the most powerful men in America. The maitre d' had pulled him aside earlier that afternoon with news that would change everything. "David, I need you on the private dining room tonight. We have Richard Chen coming in with his investment team. 12 people total. The head chef specifically requested you for this service." David had worked at this Manhattan restaurant for almost 3 years now. He knew every wine on the menu, could describe each dish like poetry, and had built a reputation for making even the most difficult customers feel like royalty. But this was different. Richard Chen wasn't just rich. He was the kind of rich that bought entire companies before breakfast. Walking through the main dining room, David caught glimpses of the usual crowd. Wall Street executives celebrating deals, celebrities trying to eat in peace, and tourists who had saved for months just to afford one meal here. But none of them compared to what waited in the private room upstairs. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. David used those 30 seconds to remind himself of everything he'd learned, not just about serving tables, but about reading people. In his 3 years here, he'd served everyone from movie stars to politicians. The secret wasn't just bringing food. It was understanding what each person needed to feel important. The private dining room was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, and the table was set with crystal that probably cost more than David made in a month. 12 place settings, each one perfect. The sommelier was already there, organizing wines that David knew cost hundreds of dollars per bottle. "Remember," the head waiter whispered to David, "Chen likes everything explained, but keep it brief. He's smart. Don't talk down to him, but don't assume he knows culinary terms. And whatever you do, don't mention his money. He hates when people act different around him because of it." David nodded, filing away every piece of advice. He'd heard stories about Chen. The man had started with nothing, built a tech empire, and was now worth more money than most people could imagine. But unlike other billionaires, Chen was known for being down to earth. He still remembered what it was like to struggle. The guests started arriving at 7 sharp. David watched through the service window as they filtered in. These weren't just wealthy people. These were the people who decided where money flowed in America. Venture capitalists, bank executives, tech founders who'd already made their fortunes and were looking for the next big thing. Chen arrived last, and David was surprised by how normal he looked. Medium height, simple black suit, no flashy watch or jewelry. If David had seen him on the street, he never would have guessed this man could buy the entire restaurant without thinking twice about it. "Good evening, everyone," Chen said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Thank you all for coming. I know you're busy, so let's eat first and talk business after. I've heard incredible things about tonight's menu." David stepped forward with the first course, delicate amuse-bouche that looked like tiny works of art. As he placed each plate, he listened to the conversation flowing around the table. These people spoke in numbers that made David's head spin. Millions moved around like pocket change, investments that could change entire industries discussed over appetizers. "The food tech space is exploding right now," one woman was saying. "Plant-based proteins, lab-grown meat, automated restaurants. People want convenience, but they also want quality." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly why I'm interested in the restaurant business. Not the technology side, the human side. People eat with their emotions, not just their stomachs. The most successful restaurants understand that." David found himself paying closer attention. He'd always known food was emotional. His grandmother had taught him that. But hearing it from someone like Chen made it feel more real, more important. Star. Second course was a seafood creation that had taken the kitchen team hours to prepare. David explained each element as he served, watching Chen's face for reactions. The billionaire listened carefully, asked smart questions, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding what made each dish special. You know, Chen continued, his earlier conversation, I've been thinking about opening a chain of restaurants. Not fast food, something that brings fine dining to more people. Make great food accessible without making it cheap. One of his guests laughed. Richard, you could buy every restaurant in the city if you wanted. Why start from scratch? Chen smiled. Because buying something that already exists doesn't create anything new. I want to find people with real talent, real passion, and give them the resources to do something amazing. David's ears perked up as he moved around the table. This wasn't just business talk. Chen meant every word. David had spent years watching wealthy people talk about their projects, and he could tell the difference between someone showing off and someone with a real vision. The third course arrived, and David noticed something unusual happening in the kitchen. The sous chef, who was supposed to help with the main course preparation, was nowhere to be seen. Through the service window, David could see the kitchen team looking stressed. Hey, David, called the head chef during a quiet moment. Antoine called in sick and we're behind on the duck course. I know you're not supposed to be back here, but I've seen you watching us work. Think you could help with some basic prep? David's heart jumped. He'd been taking culinary classes at night for 2 years, and before that, his grandmother had taught him everything she knew about cooking. He'd always dreamed of working in a professional kitchen, but his job as a server paid the bills and covered his tuition. I can help, David said quickly. What do you need? The next 20 minutes flew by in a blur. David found himself working alongside professional chefs, his hands moving with confidence he didn't know he possessed. The duck confit required perfect timing, precise temperature control, and an understanding of how flavors built on each other. Everything his grandmother had taught him, everything he'd learned in school, came together in those 20 minutes. The cherry gastrique was where David made his mark. Instead of following the recipe exactly, he added a tiny amount of black pepper and a splash of bourbon, techniques his grandmother had shown him for balancing sweet and savory flavors. It was a small change, but David knew it would make the dish sing. When the course was ready, David returned to his serving duties. He carried the plates out with steady hands, but inside his mind was racing. He'd just cooked food that would be eaten by one of the most powerful men in America, and no one even knew it was his work. As he placed the duck confit in front of Chen, David held his breath. This wasn't just any dish. This was his dish. His techniques, his small improvements, his grandmother's wisdom made real on a plate worth more than most people's weekly salary. The room continued buzzing with conversation about business deals and investment opportunities, but David found himself watching Chen's face as the billionaire took his first bite. Something extraordinary was about to happen, and David could feel it building like electricity in the air. Richard Chen lifted the fork to his mouth, and David watched from the corner of the room, trying to look busy while his heart hammered against his ribs. The billionaire's face was relaxed, still deep in conversation with his investment team about market trends and consumer behavior. Then something shifted. Chen's expression changed the moment the duck touched his tongue. His eyes widened slightly, and he stopped mid-sentence in his conversation about quarterly projections. The fork stayed in his mouth longer than normal, like he was trying to understand something complex and wonderful. "Excuse me," Chen said quietly, to his dinner companion, holding up one finger. He took another bite, this time more deliberately. He closed his eyes for just a moment, and David could see him really thinking about what he was experiencing. The other guests didn't notice at first. They kept talking about startup valuations and market penetration strategies, but Chen had gone completely silent, focused entirely on the plate in front of him. He tried the cherry gastrique by itself, then combined it with the duck, then tasted the perfectly caramelized vegetables that had been artfully arranged around the protein. David felt like time was moving in slow motion. Every second that Chen spent analyzing the dish felt like an hour. David's palms were getting sweaty, and he realized he was holding his breath. This was his food, his techniques, his grandmother's wisdom, being judged by someone who probably ate at the world's best restaurants every week. Chen set down his fork and looked around the table. The conversation was still flowing around him, something about cryptocurrency and emerging markets. But Chen wasn't listening anymore. He tapped his water glass gently with his knife, and the sound cut through the chatter like a bell. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chen said, his voice carrying that authority that comes naturally to people used to being heard. "I need everyone to stop talking for a moment." The table went quiet instantly. 12 of America's most powerful investors turned to look at their host, wondering what could be so important that it would interrupt their discussion of a potential $100 million deal. Chen picked up his fork again and gestured toward his plate. "I've been eating at restaurants like this for 15 years. I've had dinner with celebrity chefs, eaten at places with 3 Michelin stars, traveled to cities just to try one specific dish. But this..." He took another bite, shaking his head, in amazement. "This is something completely different." One of the women at the table, a venture capitalist David recognized from magazine covers, looked confused. "It's very good, Richard, but what makes it so special?" "It's duck." Chen laughed, but not in a dismissive way, more like someone who'd just discovered a secret that was too good to keep to himself. "It's not just duck. Look, I know food. I've invested in restaurant chains. I understand the business. But this dish has something I rarely experience anymore. Surprise." He pointed to different elements on his plate as he spoke. "The protein is cooked perfectly, yes. The vegetables are beautiful, yes. But it's the gastrique that's incredible. There's something in here, some flavor combination that shouldn't work, but absolutely does. It's sweet, but there's depth to it. There's a tiny bit of heat, maybe black pepper, and something else. Bourbon? Just a touch, but it transforms everything." David's knees almost gave out. Chen had identified exactly what David had added to the recipe. Not just that he'd changed it, but specifically what he'd changed and why it worked. This man understood food on a level that went beyond just eating expensive meals. The other guests started paying more attention to their own plates now, trying to taste what Chen was describing. David watched them discovering the same flavors, the same perfect balance that had taken David years of learning to achieve. "Richard," said one of the men, a tech CEO who'd made billions from social media, "you're starting to sound like a food critic instead of an investor." Chen grinned. "Maybe that's the point. We spend so much time talking about disrupting industries and finding the next big thing. But sometimes the next big thing is just someone who understands their craft better than anyone else. Someone who takes something familiar and makes it extraordinary." He took another bite, savoring it like he was trying to memorize the taste. "Whoever cooked this dish understands something that most chefs never learn. It's not about fancy ingredients or complicated techniques. It's about knowing exactly when to break the rules and how to do it without losing the soul of the dish." The sommelier appeared at Chen's elbow. "Is everything satisfactory with the course, sir?" "More than satisfactory," Chen replied. "It's remarkable, but I need to ask you something. Who prepared this dish? I'd like to speak with the chef." David's stomach dropped to his feet. The sommelier looked confused for a moment, then glanced toward the kitchen. "I believe Chef Rodriguez oversaw the preparation, sir. Would you like me to ask him to come out?" "Yes, please," Chen said. "But I want to know specifically who cooked this duck, not who supervised, not who designed the recipe, who actually put this plate together." The sommelier hurried toward the kitchen, and David realized he had about 30 seconds to figure out what he was going to do. He could let the head chef take credit, which would be the safe choice. No one would ever know he'd helped in the kitchen. He could keep his job, keep his head down, keep working toward his culinary degree one night class at a time, or he could tell the truth and risk everything. The sommelier returned quickly, whispering something in Chen's ear. David watched the conversation, trying to read their expressions. Chen's eyebrows went up in surprise, and he looked directly at David across the room. "You," Chen said, his voice carrying clearly across the private dining room. "Could you come over here for a moment?" David's legs felt like they belonged to someone else as he walked toward the table. Every eye in the room was on him now. These weren't just wealthy people anymore. These were some of the most successful business leaders in America, and they were all staring at a server who made $12 an hour plus tips. "I understand you helped prepare this dish," Chen said. His voice wasn't accusatory, just curious. "Is that correct?" David looked around the room at all those expectant faces. His job was probably over either way. If he lied and Chen found out, he'd be fired for dishonesty. If he told the truth, he'd be fired for overstepping his role as a server. But looking at Chen's face, David saw something he hadn't expected. The billionaire wasn't trying to get him in trouble. He looked genuinely interested, like someone who'd found something unexpected and wanted to understand it better. "Yes, sir," David said quietly. "The sous chef was sick, and they needed help with the preparation. I made the gastrique and handled the final seasoning on the duck." Chen leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "And where did you learn to cook like this?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. David realized that everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed about, might depend on how he answered in the next few seconds. The room was completely silent now. Even the servers had stopped moving. It felt like the entire restaurant was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when a billionaire discovered that his favorite dish had been prepared by someone who wasn't supposed to be cooking at all. David stood there for what felt like forever, looking into the expectant faces of 12 of the most powerful people in America. His mouth felt dry, and he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. But something about Richard Chen's expression gave him courage. The billionaire wasn't looking at him like he was just a server who'd overstepped his bounds. He was looking at him like he was genuinely curious about what David had to say. "I learned to cook from my grandmother first," David said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "She worked as a cook for different families when I was growing up. Not fancy restaurants like this, just regular people's homes. But she always said cooking wasn't really about following recipes. It was about understanding what each ingredient wanted to become." Chen leaned forward slightly, clearly interested. "What do you mean by that?" David felt the nervousness start to fade as he talked about something he truly understood. "Well, like with the gastrique tonight, the recipe called for just cherries, sugar, and vinegar. But when I tasted it, something was missing. The cherries wanted to be more than just sweet, you know. So I added just a tiny bit of black pepper to give them some backbone, and a splash of bourbon because cherries and bourbon have this natural friendship that most people never explore." One of the investors, a woman who'd been quiet most of the evening, spoke up. "You changed the recipe? Aren't you supposed to follow what the chef tells you exactly?" David's cheeks got warm. "Yes, ma'am, I probably should have asked first. But in the moment, it just felt right. My grandmother always taught me that recipes are like maps. They'll get you to your destination, but sometimes you find a better path along the way." Chen was nodding slowly. "And where else did you learn? Just from your grandmother?" "I'm taking culinary classes at night," David explained. "The Community College of New York has a great program. I work here during the day to pay for school and help support my little sister. She's studying business at SUNY, and our parents died a few years ago, so it's just us now." The room had gone completely quiet. These were people who dealt with business plans and profit margins all day. But David's simple honesty seemed to have caught them off guard. "What's your ultimate goal?" Chen asked. "Why are you studying culinary arts?" This was the question David had been asking himself for 3 years. He'd never said his dreams out loud to anyone except his sister. But something about this moment made him feel like he should be completely honest. "I want to open my own restaurant someday," David said. "But not like this place, as beautiful as it is. I want to create something that brings together the kind of cooking my grandmother taught me with all the techniques I'm learning in school. Soul food, but elevated. Comfort food that makes people feel loved, but also shows them flavors they've never experienced before. Chen's eyes lit up. Can you give me an example? David thought for a moment. Like, instead of regular mac and cheese, what if you used 3 different artisan cheeses and added some truffle oil, but then finished it with a breadcrumb topping that had herbs my grandmother grew in her little garden? Or taking something simple like fried chicken and brining it in buttermilk with herbs that have been in my family for generations, then serving it with sides that tell the story of where that food comes from. One of the men at the table, a restaurant, chain owner worth hundreds of millions, laughed. Kid, that sounds like fusion food. That market's been done to death. But Chen held up his hand. No, I think you're missing the point. David isn't talking about fusion for the sake of being trendy. He's talking about honoring tradition while pushing it forward. That's completely different. David felt a surge of gratitude toward Chen for understanding what he was really trying to say. Exactly, sir. It's not about being fancy just to be fancy. It's about taking the foods that have fed families for generations and showing people that they deserve the same respect as any French or Italian cuisine. Chen was really engaged now, asking questions like he was interviewing David for a position. What's the biggest challenge you see in making that vision reality? Money, honestly, David said with a small laugh. It takes a lot of capital to open any restaurant. But the kind of place I'm dreaming about would need to be in the right neighborhood, with the right equipment, and I'd need to hire people who understand the vision. Right now, I'm just trying to finish school and keep the lights on, but also respect, added David, getting more passionate as he talked. People hear soul food, and they automatically think it's cheap or simple. But the techniques my grandmother used, the way she could make a pot of greens that would make you cry with happiness, or cornbread that was perfect every single time without ever measuring anything, that's not simple. That's mastery. Chen nodded enthusiastically. I grew up eating my mother's Chinese cooking. She never used recipes either, just cooked by feel and experience. But when I take clients to expensive Chinese restaurants, they act like it's so exotic and sophisticated. It's the same food my mother made for $3 worth of ingredients, just presented differently. That's exactly what I mean, David said, forgetting for a moment that he was talking to a billionaire and 12 investors. Food has stories and culture and history. But somewhere along the way, we decided that only certain stories were worth telling in fancy restaurants. The woman who'd questioned him earlier was looking at David with new interest. So your restaurant would tell different stories? Every dish would tell a story, David said. Like, I'd want to have a dish that honors the field workers who picked the vegetables. And maybe another one that celebrates the grandmothers who kept these recipes alive when nobody else thought they were important. Food is about more than just eating. It's about remembering where we came from and sharing that with other people. Chen was quiet for a long moment, just looking at David thoughtfully. The other investors were exchanging glances, clearly wondering where this conversation was headed. Finally, Chen spoke. David, I have to ask you something important. Are you happy serving tables? David blinked, not sure how to answer that. I mean, it's a good job. It pays the bills, and I'm learning a lot about the restaurant business. But if you're asking if it's what I want to do forever, he shook his head. No, sir. This is just the stepping stone to something bigger. What if I told you, Chen said, slowly, that I've been looking for exactly what you just described? Not someone who wants to copy what already exists, but someone with a genuine vision for something new? Someone who understands that great food comes from the heart, not just from technique? David felt his knees go weak again. I'd say that sounds too good to be true, sir, Chen smiled. The best opportunities usually do. 6 months later, David stood in front of a beautifully restored building in Brooklyn, keys trembling in his hand. The morning sun was casting perfect light through the large windows, and he could already picture exactly what this space would become. Richard Chen stood beside him, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, looking nothing like the billionaire he was. "Well," Chen said with a grin, "are you going to open the door or just stare at it all day?" David laughed nervously and slid the key into the lock. The door opened with a satisfying click, and they stepped into what would soon become heritage. David's restaurant, his dream, his tribute to everything his grandmother had taught him about food and love. The space was perfect. High ceilings, with exposed brick walls, an open kitchen design that would let diners see the magic happening, and enough room for about 60 people to share meals that would tell the story of American comfort food in a whole new way. "I still can't believe this is really happening," David said, his voice echoing in the empty space. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind that David still couldn't quite wrap his head around. After that incredible night at Le Bernardin, he'd gone home to his tiny apartment and sat at his kitchen table until 3 in the morning, just staring at Chen's business card. His sister Lisa had found him there when she got back from her late shift at the campus library. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she'd said, dropping her backpack and sitting across from him. "What happened at work tonight?" David had told her everything, every single detail of the conversation, the offer, the way Chen had looked at him like he was seeing someone important instead of just another server. Lisa had listened without interrupting, her eyes getting wider with each part of the story. "David," she'd said when he finished, "you have to call him. But what if it's too good to be true? What if he changes his mind? What if I'm not actually good enough to pull this off?" Lisa had reached across the table and taken his hands. "Remember what Grandma used to tell us? She'd say, 'Baby, scared money don't make no money.' She took risks her whole life to give us something better. Now it's your turn." David had called. Chen the next morning, his hands shaking as he dialed the number. Chen had answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting for the call. "I was hoping to hear from you," Chen had said warmly. "Are you ready to change your life?" What followed were months of the most intensive learning David had ever experienced. Chen hadn't just thrown money at the project and walked away. He'd connected David with the best restaurant consultants in New York, enrolled him in an advanced culinary program at the Institute of Culinary Education, and introduced him to successful restaurant owners who shared their hardest-earned lessons. David had learned about food costs and profit margins, about managing staff and dealing with suppliers, about the 1,000 little details that made the difference between a restaurant that succeeded and one that failed within 6 months. But more than that, he'd learned to trust his own instincts, while respecting the business side of his dreams. The menu development had been the most exciting part. David had spent weeks in test kitchens, working with professional chefs to translate his grandmother's recipes into dishes that could be prepared consistently in a restaurant setting. The mac and cheese that had been just an idea in his head became a signature dish featuring aged Gruyere, sharp cheddar, and white truffle oil, topped with breadcrumbs seasoned with herbs that David now grew himself in a small garden behind the restaurant. The fried chicken became something magical, brined for 24 hours in buttermilk infused with his grandmother's secret blend of spices, then served with sides that told stories. Collard greens cooked with smoked turkey instead of pork, cornbread made with real cornmeal and just a touch of honey, and sweet potato mash that was so good it made grown men cry. But the duck remained special. The dish that had started everything would be on Heritage's menu exactly as David had prepared it that night. Duck confit with cherry gastrique enhanced with black pepper and bourbon, a tribute to the moment when everything changed. "The contractor says we'll be ready to open in 2 months, Chen said, walking around the empty space and envisioning the finished restaurant. "Are you nervous?" David considered the question seriously. "Terrified," he admitted, "but also more excited than I've ever been in my life. 6 months ago, I was worried about paying for textbooks. Now I'm about to open a restaurant with one of the most successful businessmen in America as my partner." Chen stopped walking and turned to face David. You know what I've learned about you in these past 6 months? You don't just cook food, you create experiences. Every dish you've shown me tells a story, honors a tradition, but also pushes things forward. That's not something you can teach someone. That's a gift. David felt the familiar warmth in his chest that came whenever Chen talked about his potential. Over the months, their relationship had evolved from business partnership to something that felt almost like mentorship or even friendship. Chen had become genuinely invested in David's success, not just financially, but personally. I got a call yesterday, Chen continued, from a food critic at the New York Times. Word is getting out about heritage, about what we're trying to do here. People are already talking about the menu, about the story behind the restaurant. We haven't even opened yet, and we're already booked solid for the first month. David's eyes widened. The New York Times wants to review us? Eventually, yes. But that's not pressure. That's opportunity. You've got something special here, David. Food that comes from the heart, techniques that honor both tradition and innovation, and a story that people want to be part of. David walked over to where the kitchen would be, imagining himself working, alongside a team of cooks who shared his vision. He thought about his grandmother, about all those afternoons spent in her tiny kitchen, learning that cooking was about more than just feeding people. It was about love, about preserving culture, about bringing people together around something essential and beautiful. You know what the best part is? David said, turning back to Chen. My grandmother would have loved this. She always said that good food should make people feel like family, even if they're strangers. That's what I want heritage to be. A place where people come as customers but leave feeling like they're part of something bigger. Chen smiled. That's exactly why this is going to work, David. You understand that restaurants aren't really about food. They're about making people happy. The food is just how you deliver that happiness. As they prepared to leave, David took one last look around the empty space that would soon be filled with laughter, conversation, and the kind of meals that create memories. In 2 months, the first customers would walk through that door, sit at these tables, and taste food that represented everything David had learned about honoring the past while embracing the future. The scared young man who had served duck confit to a billionaire was gone. In his place stood a confident chef and restaurant owner, ready to share his grandmother's legacy with the world. Let me tell you something about myself, Chen began, leaning back in his chair. 25 years ago, I was working in a computer repair shop in San Francisco. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, fixing machines that other people had given up on. I was good at it, but I wasn't happy. You know why? David shook his head, genuinely curious. Because I was using my skills to maintain other people's visions, instead of creating my own. Every day, I'd go home thinking about ideas I had for software, for ways to make technology more human, more connected to what people actually needed. But I was too scared to try, too worried about failing, about losing the steady paycheck. Chen paused, looking out the window at the city lights. Then one day, a customer brought in a computer that everyone else had said was unfixable. It would have cost more to repair than to buy a new one. But I saw something in it that others missed. It wasn't broken. It was just being used wrong. So I rebuilt it, changed how it worked completely, and turned it into something better than it had ever been. David was hanging on every word, sensing that this story was going somewhere important. That computer became the prototype for my first company. I took something everyone else saw as worthless and turned it into something valuable. But more than that, I realized that my real talent wasn't fixing things. It was seeing potential where other people saw problems. Chen turned to look directly at David. Tonight, when I tasted your dish, I didn't just taste good food. I tasted potential. I tasted someone who sees ingredients the way I used to see broken computers, not as they are, but as what they could become. David felt his heart starting to race again. Mr. Chen, I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm not sure I understand where this is going. Chen smiled. I've been looking for someone like you for 3 years, David. Someone with real skill, real passion, and a vision that goes beyond just making money. I want to offer you something, but I need you to hear me out completely before you say anything. David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. I want to make you a partner in a new restaurant. Not an employee, not a consultant, a full partner. You'd have creative control over the menu, the concept, the entire culinary vision.